Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 2, the son who would be king. The psalm begins, Psalm 2, verse 1. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? Now, I want to point out the parallelism here. You notice you have a reference to the nations and the peoples. That's just two different terms that describe basically the same thing. And notice what they're doing is the same, an uproar and devising a vain thing. That's, again, two different ways of describing the same thing. The nations, the people, that's the folk that are out there. He continues, verse 2, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together. And notice again, kings and rulers, that's two different ways of describing the same thing. And they take their stand, they take counsel together, but now we see that it is directed in a specific way. It's against the Lord. So they're taking their stand, their counsel together against the Lord, but also against his anointed. Now, that term, his anointed, the way you say anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. So we say Messiah. That's the same word. That's where we get our Hebrew word Messiah. When you want to say it in Greek, you say Christ or Christos, but this is Hebrew. This is Old Testament. So notice the kings of the earth take their stand, rulers take counsel together against the Lord. Notice how the word Lord is in all capital letters. That's the translator's way of letting you know that's the name of God. Some folks pronounce that Yahweh. We're not really sure exactly how to be pronounced, but that's pretty close. So against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, and notice what they say, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. In other words, fetters and cords, those are the things that bind you. We no longer want to be bound by the Lord, that's what they're saying, or by his anointed one. So this is the charge of rebellion. This is the language of rebellion. And we begin these first three verses making a charge. The charge is that the nations and the people are in rebellion against the Lord and against his anointed one. We continue into verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laugh. Now, the one who sits in the heavens, that's of course the Lord. And then second line is saying the same thing. The Lord scoffs at them. So laughing and scoffing, that's parallelism. It's saying the same thing. Verse 5, then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. Notice the synonyms there, the words that say essentially the same thing. He speaks to them, he terrifies them, his anger, his fury. And here's what he says, verse 6, but as for me, I have installed my king. Now, we saw previously a reference to his anointed one, the Messiah. This time it changes. Now I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Of course, Zion was the name of that city in Jerusalem, and then the holy mountain is just another term for that. So we saw in the first three verses it was rebellion against the Messiah. Now in verses 4 through 6, we see the installation of the king. Notice, I have installed my king. Doesn't matter what they want to do. They might be rebelling, but God says, my actions supersede theirs. My actions overcome theirs. And so he laughs at the attempt to rebel. He scoffs at them. He laughs. And then he says, now let's get serious. I've installed my king. We come to verse 7. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, and here's the decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Notice that the begotten one, that's what a son is. A son is somebody you've begotten. And so we went from the Messiah to the king, but now there's the decree of the son. And so notice the different titles that are used here. Today I've begotten you, and he continues this the part of this decree, but also as he's addressing to the, he's speaking these words to the Son. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance. So the nations are given, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. Now, those are for those of you who are Christians, those are familiar terms, the nations and the ends of the earth. We actually see that later on in the New Testament. In as far as the nations are concerned, remember Matthew chapter 28, beginning verse 18, where Jesus, after his death, burial, and then after his resurrection, he gathers his disciples and he gives them the Great Commission, going, make disciples of all the nations. That's actually the language of go get my inheritance, make the disciples of the nations, baptizing them and teaching them all the things that I told you, and lo, I am with you always. That's how the book of Matthew ends. But then the ends of the earth, when we come to the book of Acts, remember there's a little bit of overlap where you've got Matthew, actually Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all speak of the resurrection. But then in the book of Acts, as it opens up, Jesus has already risen, but he has not yet ascended into heaven, and he gives his apostles his great commission. You say, well, wasn't that in Acts 28? Yes, but then they're asking him, oh, well, are you going to give the kingdom now? And he says, I'm going. That's not given to you to know at the times of the season, but here's what is given to you: that once my Spirit comes upon you, you're going to receive power, and you will be witnesses of me to Jerusalem, to Judea, and to Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. So notice the very ends of the earth. That's the language right out of Acts chapter 1:8. Of course, we're in Hebrew here. That's in Greek. But ask of me, I will surely give you the nations as your inheritance, the very ends of the earth as your possession. That's speaking of what the Messiah would do. He would eventually take the nations as his inheritance. And it wouldn't just be there in the land right around Israel, the very ends of the earth as your possession. And then finally, verse 9, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Now that term, to break, actually that idea, to break them with a rod of iron, to shatter them. Notice the rod of iron is what does the breaking. That to shatter them like imagine iron versus earthenware, a hammer versus a plate. that's sort of the imagery here, and that image is quoted not once, not twice, but 3 different times in the book of Revelation. To describe Jesus, who is going to break them with a, notice he breaks all resistance against them. Those who are in rebellion, doesn't matter, he's going to win. He breaks them, shatters them like earthenware. And then we sum up in verses 10 through 12. Now, therefore, O kings, show discernment. Notice we're still in that parallelism. Kings show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Kings and judges, in both cases, those are people who rule, who make judgments, who exercise authority. Verse 11: worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. So worship and rejoice, those 2 terms are both in parallel with one another. Notice with reverence and with trembling, saying basically the same thing. And so what we have here is worship the Lord, and we haven't read verse 12 yet, but it's going to be saying basically the same thing: worship, but also do homage to the Son. Let's look at that. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way. And let me just finish the verse, and then I want to go back and look at that term. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, when we say do homage to the Son, the Hebrew, nishku bar. Bar is one of the words for son. You're probably used to ben instead of bar, but they both work. But this nishku, literally, you can probably render it a few different ways. If you want to be really literal, it's the same term that's used way back when Jacob, remember, he's pretending to be Esau, and he goes in and kisses his father. And so that's that word, kiss the Son. Do homage to the Son, kiss the Son. Now, when we read that with our 21st century sort of sensibilities, we imagine going and kissing the Son on the cheek, maybe like Judas Iscariot did with his betrayal. But actually, in the Old Testament, the and that's why they translate it do homage to the Son instead of kiss the Son. They don't want you to get the wrong idea. This actually presents the idea of coming down, and what would happen? They would kiss toward the person. And so here I'm actually showing a picture of a inscription known as the Black Obelisk. It's actually depicting one of the Israelite kings who comes before the king of Assyria, and he bows down before him and kisses the ground in front of him. So he's doing homage. He's kissing toward, not the Son in that case, this is toward some pagan king. But that's the language that's being used here. Kiss toward the Son, that is, bow down before him, do homage, that he not become angry. In other words, stop your rebellion and instead turn to him, bow down before him, lest he become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. That's the warning. So notice there's anger, there's wrath, again, the parallelism. And then verse 12 is actually almost like a standalone. How blessed are all those who take refuge in him. Now, what is so interesting about this psalm is the place where it's quoted in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 23, Acts chapter 4, verse 23, this is the place where the apostles had been, and Peter and John in particular, had been arrested and then brought before the Jewish authorities, and they'd been questioned and they'd been put on trial, and they'd been told, don't teach about Jesus anymore. They'd been saying Jesus is risen from the dead, and they've been healing people, and the Jewish authorities said, stop that, don't do that anymore. So they warned them, verse 23, when they had been released, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and the elders had said to them. Verse 24, and when they heard this, they lifted up their voices to God with one accord and said, and we actually have their prayer. O Lord, it is you who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. If that sounds a little familiar, that's actually right out of Exodus chapter 20, when God is described as the one who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. So they're actually, it would be like if we were to say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, begin our prayer that way with a prayer from the scriptures. And so they're doing the same thing. But notice verse 25, who by the Holy Spirit, through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said. And what they're going to do is quote from Psalm 2, even though Psalm 2 did not have an inscription that said it's from David. We would have read it if it did, but it did not have that superscription. So sometimes the Psalms, you have a superscription that tells who wrote it. That Psalm didn't have one, but here we read that it is out of our father David. And now they begin with the same words that we began Psalm 2 with. Notice, why did the Gentiles rage? Now it's Greek instead of Hebrew, so allow a little bit of wiggle room for the translation, but it's saying essentially the same thing. Why did instead of nations, the Gentiles rage and the peoples devise futile things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his, remember it said Messiah in our translation, but here it says against his Christ. It's just Greek instead of Hebrew. It says the same thing. And so what they're doing is they're taking that psalm and they're applying it to their particular day, to their particular circumstances, to their particular message. And the passage goes on. Notice they're making that application. So their prayer continues, for truly, they are praying, in this city there were gathered against your holy servant. They're speaking to the Father, to God. There were in the city gathered against your holy servant, Jesus, whom you anointed. Both, and then the kings and the judges, they're actually mentioning both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. Notice how everybody sort of got into that act when they were putting Jesus together. Verse 28, but they were doing, notice, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. They're saying, look, even though Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles, the people of Israel, they were all putting Jesus to death, what they were doing was according to God's hand and God's purpose, because he had predestined that would take place. Verse 29, we continue, and now, Lord, take note of their threats and grant that your bondservants, that's us, that your bondservants may speak your word with all confidence. They've just been told, don't speak about that anymore. And now they're saying, Lord, not only are we planning, we ask that you would grant us the authority and the confidence to do that. Verse 30, while you extend your hand, remember how kiss toward the Son, lest he be angry, because he's going to rule. He's the king, he's the ruling king. Verse 30, while you extend your hand to heal, and signs and wonders take place through the name of your holy servant, Jesus. They're praying that the rest of the psalm would be fulfilled as they continue to faithfully proclaim Jesus. So let's look again at the way that psalm ended. We already read, do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. And now the last line, a standalone line, how blessed are all who take refuge in him. And that brings us to a question. Have you taken refuge in him? He came to die in your place. That's what the Messiah was meant to do. He came and did God's will, what God had predestined, what God had announced by the prophets. Have you trusted in him? It's only as you trust in him that you find that you have taken refuge in him, in the shadow of his cross.